Hi, I appreciate you joining me today. This is the Apologist Bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. Frank Turek is a terrific person. He's the president of crossexamine.org. He's the co-author of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I love that title. And he wrote a book called Stealing from God, and I've done a previous podcast on it. And by the way, I need to stress this. When I jump from book to book and chapter to chapter, some of you may say, well, I'd kind of like to know what the book said in the other chapters that I've looked at. So, for example, I'm doing Stealing from God. This is not the first. This is the second podcast from that. If you want to take a look at the first podcast and have a listen, you go to just the home page there for the Podbean, and you go at the top. It has home, subscriber, profile, connect, and then it has that little magnifying glass. So if you click on that and you enter Stealing from God, then you'll be able to see the first podcast. So that'd be a way that you could access it. Might be helpful. So this book, Stealing from God, it shows how a lot of the atheistic arguments that are out there that are done as a way to disprove God actually reveal that he exists, which is kind of ironic, huh? So he has chapters on causality, reason, information and intentionality, morality, evil, and science. So I did the intro to the book in the first podcast. I'd like to do chapter 4, morality, and its subtitle is Stealing Rights from God. So he starts with giving just a horrific true story, unfortunately, of where we got Megan's Law. You know, the idea that a local community has to be informed when a sex offender moves into town. Well, in 1994, a man named Jesse Timendakos, murdered a beautiful young girl. And so they didn't know that he was a sex offender, and he lived just across the street. So it's an awful thing. And he says, imagine being the parent of a murdered child whose killer is still on the loose. You'd feel some terrible injustice. What if you never got caught? Now, he said a 3-year study of child murder showed that about a third of them went unsolved. Now, he says, if there is no God, and if there's no afterlife, then no justice will ever be done. These men, these pedophiles, will go to their graves unpunished. He says there was a debate. Richard Dawkins, one of everybody's favorite new atheists, had a debate with John Lennox. By the way, I love John Lennox. You can find a lot of his material on YouTube and books. Well, in a debate, this is what Dawkins said. Too bad. Just because we wish there was ultimate justice doesn't mean there is. And Frank Turek says, true, but if justice doesn't exist, then neither does injustice. He says something can't be not right unless something really is right. He says if God doesn't exist and all we are is just mindless, purposeless products of biological evolution, then morality is subjective, not objective. In other words, just up to us. He says that means things like rape and murder of a child, it's not really unjust. I mean, if you think it is, that's just your opinion. That's pretty grim, isn't it? One time, Dawkins had a radio interview with Justin Brierley, and I like Justin Brierley a lot. You can look up his material as well. His last name is Brierley. So they were going back and forth about sense of morality. Brierley says, ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. And Dawkins says, yeah, you could say that. So according to Richard Dawkins, rape isn't really wrong. It's just arbitrary if you believe that. So Frank Turek says, do you think the murder of your child or any child would be nothing more than just somebody acting unfashionably? He said, that's what you have to believe. If you're going to be a consistent atheist, you have to suppress, Frank says, your most basic moral intuitions, things like murder's wrong, rape is wrong. Because without God, there is no objective, unchanging standard of morality. And so according to atheism, everything that you do is just a result of blind forces. You don't have any control over that. Justice and morality and free will, they don't really exist. And once again, here's what Dawkins says. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. and other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So he said, if you're going to hold people morally responsible for their actions, then what does an atheist have to do? They have to steal free will and morality from God. He says, imagine, if you had a society that didn't hold people morally responsible for their actions, there wouldn't be a civilization. It'd be anarchy. Dawkins actually recognizes this. He rejects the Darwinian survival of the fittest ethics, which is kind of interesting, isn't it? So he's got his own moral code. He says the Darwinian morality is ruthless. He said, I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to the way we should organize our lives and our morality. We want to avoid basing our society on Darwinian principles. Well, wait a minute, Frank says. He just has claimed we just dance to our DNA, but now he's got a moral code that we're not supposed to follow our DNA. And as Frank says, consistency doesn't seem to be a strong point. Yeah. Well, he said he did a debate one time, he being Frank, did a debate with the president of American Atheists, David Silverman. He claimed it was immoral to deny homosexuals the opportunity to adopt children. But then, later on, he said there's no objective morality. All morality is relative. So Turek says in the debate, David, you're just talking about leaving a kid in an orphanage rather than putting him with a gay couple. You call that immoral. I thought you just told us there is no such thing as objective morality. Is it immoral or you just don't like it? No, Silverman said. I said there was no such thing as objective morality. I said all morality is relative. Turek, so why are you objecting to someone who doesn't want to put a kid with a homosexual couple then? Why are you objecting? And so they go on back and forth. Now, I'll leave this out of here because it goes on a long time. But it's really interesting to hear Turek trying to pin him down. You complain about things being fair or unfair or right or wrong or just or unjust. Where are you getting that standard? Turek says at Nuremberg, because Silverman has said basically society is the standard. That's what comes up with the standard. So Turek says, well, at Nuremberg, then, we didn't really have any right to convict the Nazis for obeying their government. Yeah, Silverman says we all make our own moral decisions. And then Turek's back again. We have no real way to condemn the Nazis for what they did. And Silverman says the hard answer is you're correct. So, interesting. He says David needs to come to his senses. He needs to take back his assertion that murdering 6 million Jews is just a matter of opinion. But to do that, he'd have to appeal to an unchanging authoritative standard outside of himself. He said that's what atheists don't have. What do they have? Molecules. They don't have God. So he said, if you want an unchanging, objective standard of justice, you need an objective, unchanging judge who has supreme authority. That's not humans. Humans are changeable. Yeah, we've seen morality change over the years. He said even if the Nazis had won World War II and brainwashed everyone to believe that murdering Jews was right, would that make it right? No. Morality is not determined by majority vote. Morality is not determined at all, Turek says. People don't determine the right thing to do, they discover it. He said if you don't have an unchanging, objective standard, all moral questions are reduced to human opinion. And there's 7 billion of us, so you got 7 billion different opinions out there. So he then has a small section here. He says, what I'm not saying. And I think this is really useful because he said, I'm not saying you have to believe in God to be a good person or that atheists like David Silverman are immoral people. Said, actually, some atheists probably live more moral lives than Christians. He says, I'm also not saying that atheists don't know morality or that you need the Bible to know basic right and wrong. Everybody knows basic right and wrong. What I am saying, this is Turek, is that atheists can't justify morality. They can act morally, and they could judge some actions as being moral and others immoral, but they have no objective basis for those judgments. He said whether it's abortion or the Holocaust or whatever, atheists have no objective standard to judge any of it. So he says, then there's Sam Harris, right? So he goes from David Silverman to Sam Harris. He's another atheist. He believes in objective morality. He says objective morality is related to, quote, the well-being of conscious creatures, and that science could help us bring well-being to conscious creatures. So Frank scratches his head. He said, well, the question is not what method we should use to discover morality, but what actually makes something moral. Why does a moral law exist at all? And why should it have authority over us? Harris seems to think that because we can know objective morality, that explains why it exists in the first place. He said, actually, you can come to know about objective morality all over the place, from teachers and parents and your conscience. Yeah. But he said atheists can know this, but they still deny God exists, and if that's the case, there's no objective morality unless he exists. Science can't tell you whether or not you ought to hurt someone. Who said it's wrong to harm people? Sam Harris? Does he have authority over the rest of humanity? So to get that system to work, Harris has to smuggle in an objective moral standard. Remember what phrase he used? Well-being. As William Lane Craig pointed out, that's not a fail-safe criterion of what's right. He says, even if it was, what objective, unchanging moral authority establishes it as right? Here's another section of the chapter here. Well, what about evolution? Can't that explain morality? Right? An atheistic worldview can't account for it. Dawkins once said it's pretty hard to get objective morality without religion. But then atheists will say, well, evolution somehow comes up with that. It helps us survive. If we didn't cooperate, for example, then we wouldn't survive. But he said that doesn't really work. Trying to explain morality by biology is a massive category mistake. So he says that's when you treat something in one category as if it belongs in another. Like if you say, what does courage taste like? Well, that's not the right question, is it? Morality and biology are in different categories. Right? Moral laws are prescriptive. They tell us what we ought to do. Biological processes are descriptive. They tell you what is. They don't have any authority to tell you what to do. How could a mutating genetic code have the moral authority to tell you how you ought to behave? He says there's another problem about evolution explaining morality. Biological processes can't make survival a moral right. Why? Well, there's no real good or purpose to evolution. I mean, if you don't have God, survival is just a subjective preference of the creature wanting to survive. It's not a moral good or right. Biology just describes what does survive, not what ought to survive. You see the difference there? So if you can make the case that survival is a right, well, then maybe you should rape, because that would propagate DNA. Should a person murder if it helps them survive? Should a society murder the weak and undesirables to improve the gene pool and help the desirables survive? That's what Hitler did. He used evolutionary theory to justify just that. So he said evolution describes a survival of the fittest outcome. It doesn't prescribe, in other words, it doesn't tell you an ought. It doesn't prescribe a moral outcome. Here's another problem with evolution. Physical survival isn't the highest moral virtue. Sacrificing yourself to save someone else would be. How about fourth? Here's another problem. Since evolution is a process of change, then morals must change. So, if you're buying into evolution and that's your guide, morals can't be objective because they're going to be changing all the time. Here's another problem with evolution. He says, the assertion if evolution gives us morality as a kind of social contract, he said that's not an adequate ground for objective morality. Well, if someone violates that contract, is he immoral? To judge him wrong, you need to appeal to an objective moral law beyond a social contract. Now, finally, here's another problem with evolution as our guide for morality. The claim that we wouldn't survive without cooperation is a pragmatic issue, not a moral issue. He says, actually, that's not true. Many people survive and they prosper because they don't cooperate. Criminals prosper quite nicely in many cases. So do dictators. How about atheist Joseph Stalin? He murdered millions more people than he cooperated with. He never got justice in his life. He died comfortably in bed at the age of 74. He says atheists call murderers like Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot madmen. But these dictators were acting pretty reasonably, at least following their atheistic belief that if you don't have God, everything's permissible. Reason is a tool by which we discover what the moral law is, but it can't account for why the moral law exists in the first place. Yeah, exactly. Well, he said at this point, not so fast, atheists will come up with. Even if evolution doesn't work, you can't ground objective morality in God either. You're forgetting about the Euthyphro dilemma. Well, that's a character in one of Plato's writings. He poses a question. He said, and here's how it goes. Does God do something because it's good? Well, that implies there's a standard of good beyond God. Or is it good because God does it? That sounds like he's just arbitrarily making up morality. But it looks like we're in maybe some kind of dilemma, but we aren't. There's a third alternative. When it comes to morality, God doesn't look up to another standard beyond himself. The third alternative is that God's nature is the standard. Okay, so it says he wants to reiterate at this point, an atheistic worldview can't account for the objective value of human beings. Life is meaningless to the atheist. But on a Christian worldview, God is the ground and the source of ultimate value. He endows us with his image. So our lives actually have objective value. They have meaning. They have purpose. God's commands are consistent with his moral nature, and they point us toward a goal in our lives. So he said the source of our lives as human beings is God, not primordial slime. He said, if Christianity is true, what's your value coming from? Not because your talents or your intellect or anything like that. It's because you're connected to God. Now, what did Thomas Jefferson say? All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So Frank is saying because there's a God, you are inherently valuable. Man, I think that's so good to hear. I think that's great. Let's see. Dude, what's your standard? That's his next section here. Some prominent atheists have come up with their own 10 Commandments, which is kind of funny, isn't it? And Christopher Hitchens unveiled his own. Of course, if their commandments are not God's, then they're just their preferences, aren't they? But they think everybody should obey them. Oh, wait a minute. I thought you couldn't legislate morality. Well, he said, newsflash, all laws legislate morality. He said, what's morality? It's about right and wrong. And all laws declare in some kind of legal sense one thing is right, one kind of behavior, and the opposite behavior is wrong. So he says the question is not whether we can legislate morality. Of course we can. The question is going to be, yeah, but whose morality will we legislate? And it says laws can and do legislate morality without legislating religion. It says atheists have criticized Christians for trying to legislate morality, but they try to do the same thing. Exactly. So by what objective standard are abortion, same-sex marriage, same-sex adoption, taxpayer-provided health care, why are those moral rights? There isn't such a standard in the atheistic universe. So atheists have to steal from God, right? There's the title of the book. They have to steal the grounds for objective moral rights from God while arguing that God doesn't exist. Wow. But see, there's a problem. This is the key to the whole chapter. If God doesn't exist, objective moral rights don't exist, including the ones that atheists believe in. Right? The atheists will say there's no God. Okay, then there's no standard. But then they immediately decry something going on in society is wrong. Well, they should, because there are a lot of wrong things, but where are they getting that standard? As Turek starts to wind up the chapter, he talks about these prominent atheists have basically admitted that they're suppressing the truth about God because they want to follow their own desires. For example, Professor Thomas Nagel of NYU, here's what he said: I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. How about Christopher Hitchens? Same thing. They've admitted it's that cosmic authority problem. That's what the problem there. Hitchens actually described God as a cosmic North Korean dictator. They said, I concluded a debate with Christopher Hitchens this way: you can sum up Christopher's book in one sentence: there is no God, and I hate him. So he said, he's trying to say many atheists don't want Christianity to be true. He said, in many cases, reason or evidence really isn't the issue for people that turn away from God. They don't have an intellectual objection. They have an emotional, a moral, or a volitional objection. They don't want to give up their autonomy and submit their will to God. And I think that's good. When we're talking about this chapter, when it talks about morality or any of these other issues that he's going to bring up, many times when we're talking to people, we need to figure out if they really do have an intellectual concern or they just don't want there to be a God. He said many people are not really on a relentless pursuit of the truth, open to following the evidence where it leads. No. Pascal said this: people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive. Yeah, I think that's really good. So he says at the end here, he said, here's a form of an argument when you're talking about objective morality. Every law has a lawgiver. There's an objective moral law. Therefore, you know where this is going, there's an objective moral lawgiver. Or he said you could say it this way: every prescription has a prescriber. Yeah, and so, and let me say that one again, because I think that's really good, one form of the argument. And you can use this with people, because everybody feels that there's a morality out there. So you say every law has a lawgiver. Yeah, exactly. Secondly, there's an objective moral law. Well, if those two things are true, and it's hard to argue with that, then the third thing, there's an objective moral lawgiver. Objective, right? Not us, but something beyond us. He says, if there's just one action that's objectively right or wrong, then God exists. So he said, for example, if it's objectively right to love one another, or if it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun, then God exists. Sam Harris says, he tries to explain how we know objective morality rather than explaining the basis. Harris has to steal an objective moral standard from God to get his atheistic system off the ground. Yeah, so that's really good. So this is, again, the book called Stealing from God. And we can listen for that as we're talking to people, and they will smuggle in statements that they say they really don't believe in if they're atheists. So pretty interesting. Just beware of that, the irony of some of the atheistic comments. Well, thanks for being part of this podcast. Take care, and let's do another one soon.